It's not going to be the traditional way of I'm just watching it because my parents watched it. It's going to be speaking to them on social, telling stories, having more captivating ways to pull them into the sport than just sit and watch a match or watch a race. We're looking for ways to increase business opportunities without taking away from the trueness of the fandom of these sports. And I know that there's sometimes that can be a conflict when you need to make business decisions. What about Asia? I mean, Asia is going to be the next wave of athletes coming out. How do you identify them? How can you leverage video, data, other technology to be able to at least have some initial assessments of how athletes are developing? And how do you start to bring them over into your academies?
Welcome to the Football Economy, the show where we explore the business and strategy behind the beautiful game. I'm Ibrahim. Today's guest is Brian Kopp, a leading figure at the intersection of sport, technology, data, and investment. Brian is a partner at Ryan Sports Ventures and the founder of Stretch 4 Advisory, where he works closely with sports tech and performance companies to drive innovation across the industry. He's also advised major names like Riddle, Wilson Sporting Goods, and Fast Model Sports. But his work is increasingly shaping how football clubs think about performance, safety, and commercial growth. Brian, welcome to the Football Economy.
Thanks, Ibrahim. Good to see you.
Perfect. So to begin with, I'd like to basically start from the sort of like a reflection point. You built a career betting on potential, the unseen greatness in athletes, teams, and potential ideas. If you had to apply that same lens to yourself right now at the start of your journey, what's the one quality you would have considered that you possessed that even you at that time would have underestimated it?
Probably persistence. I think a lot of what goes on in any business, but especially if I look back at my career, there have been projects I've worked on that I think at the beginning of those projects, some people probably thought they were a little strange or a little bit out there, but really believed in what it could do, believed in the power of technology to increase sport and for fans and for athletes, and being persistent with that and being a little evangelical about it has really helped in a couple different ways in my careers. I think in a lot of areas of life, persistence is important, but I think specifically as I look back at things that I've done, being persistent on things has been really helpful.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme when it comes to high performing achievers in all industries. So I know I've basically sort of hinted at this at the intro when I was talking about your background. You have a very strong investment banking background, so corporate strategy or something that comes as a sort of like, as very easy to you in that sense. How do you apply this lens to sports technology, not just sports technology, but just sports in general in terms of the investment?
Sure. Well, I think in broad terms, sports has evolved quite a bit over the last few decades from a business standpoint. I think it started with ownership of clubs. I think a lot of clubs were owned by people who thought it was just fun to own a club. It was almost a hobby. They had made their money elsewhere, and then in a lot of ways, they were losing their money on the club side. I think that's changed where you see people seeing this as a true investment class. And what that has created is opportunities around those clubs, both from a technology standpoint, a media standpoint, just the fandom of sports, which has always been there. How does that become a more mature business? As you stated, I started the first part of my career in things outside of sports. I was in investment banking, private equity, worked as strategy for a few large companies, and didn't get into sports until later in my career. And I think that helped to have more of a broader business background. Think of it purely from a business strategy, finance standpoint, and not just from a sports standpoint. And the challenges the sport face are very similar to what other businesses face. Just they have a unique aspect of fandom and what people see and how they appreciate their sport. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of business elements to sports at all levels. So I think having that background outside of sports has really helped me as I got into the sports space. And I think as the overall industry evolves, we're looking for ways to increase business opportunities without taking away from the trueness of the fandom of these sports. And I know that there's sometimes that can be a conflict when you need to make business decisions that fans don't like and vice versa. But I think that having a balance between building a strong business can only make the sport that you enjoy and watch better. And I think it also spawns new opportunities. You've seen this in a lot of emerging sports and emerging leagues, just different ways of people to engage with various sports and entertainment. I think has been a good thing for the global economy.
Right. If I'm not mistaken, your work at Ryan Sports is focused on basically being an operator in whatever investments you guys participate in. Being an entrepreneur yourself, I mean, you basically are wearing several hats. I don't know how you do it. We can dive into that as we go along. I mean, first of all, just to give a bit of a background, how did you come across the idea to start Stretch4 Advisory?
Yeah, so I was leaving Catapult Sports. I was running the U.S. business of Catapult for a couple of years, and at that time, this was about 8 years ago. That was right where there was a pretty significant influx of capital looking at sports technology, companies looking in the sports technology space. So when I left Catapult, it was the first time I didn't have a kind of one full-time job, and decided to take some time to look around and talk to people. And I was pretty surprised at the number of companies out there trying to get into the overall space. And I think it's only grown exponentially since then. And the number of dollars looking into the space, but people that didn't really have a lot of background in the space, given it was relatively new. When I first started my career in sports at Stats, which is now Stats Perform, sports technology wasn't really a phrase. It was brand new. It wasn't really something that people talked about. Now there are funds dedicated on it. There are research groups that are focused on it. So it's become its own industry, but it wasn't like that in the beginning. So I found that there were a lot of companies that needed some help, and I'm very careful in calling it advisory, because the way I looked at it it was long-term partnerships working with different companies, starting in smaller sports tech. I expanded that into some bigger brands. I still do a lot of work with Riddell, which is American football helmet company. And so it really started with seeing this explosion of companies and dollars into the space and thinking that, hey, there's some ways that I could help. And that's evolved obviously over time and led to what we created with Ryan Sports Ventures about 3 years ago. But it really started with, quite frankly, let's just explore and see what's out there. And I was pretty overwhelmed by the number of companies and the amount of dollars that were being spent in this area. And again, that was 8 years ago. It's grown pretty substantially since then.
Yeah, it's true. This is something that we see as an evolution across the industry. Well, in transitioning to wearables or basically data performance
Mhm.
management when it comes to players, I mean, this is something that I think you're well versed in. So specifically around the tracking of technology in terms of like player development and player safety, where do you see like the opportunities for evolution for that when it comes to European football? I do know that American football is potentially well ahead because obviously the helmets and other aspects of the game, but specifically from your lens, from your expertise, where do you see the upside and opportunities to obviously grow that part of the game?
Yeah, it's funny because there's been data capture in global football for a long time, starting back in Opta and other technologies collecting movement data. So it's been out there for a long time. I think where it's moving is going from, I think there's evolutions of this technology. It started with the fact that you just collect this information, whether that was through cameras or through wearables like Catapult. Hey, we can collect movement data. And then we got to, how do we actually action that? How do we make decisions around that? And I think we got to the point with a lot of clubs who, with some sports science help, with some people who can interpret that data, who could also then speak to the players themselves, because again, you still need to be able to coach and to be able to explain this to players in a way that make it actionable. The technology itself won't do that. So I think been a lot of progress, and you can point to the teams that have done really well there. I think the next evolution is going a layer deeper. And by that, I mean, it's not just the location of where you are. It's getting into micro movements. It's getting into, so we invested in a company called Player Maker, which is they have wearables you put on each of your boots. And so now you're going from a wearable that the catapult sits between your shoulder blades and it captures your overall movement. Now you can get down to your gait, how you're running left and right foot, your touches, and combining what I'll call the physical output you can collect, like speed and distance and load metrics, with the tactical output in touches, passes, how that fits in the overall strategy. So I think for a long time, those two things were separate. You did your strategy work and you did your physical load work, and those were kind of in their own buckets. Now you're starting to see it blended to say, how does that make, because again, the global football is a very, very physically demanding sport, a lot of movement. So there's a lot focused on maximizing that recovery from that, making sure that players can avoid as much injury as possible. And then there's a lot on the tactic side. And I think with some of this data, you can now start to finally blend those together. Whereas up till now, they've been fairly independent because it's just, this is your physical output. This is what we're doing tactically. You're hoping they all match. Now we can start to actually combine the two, which I think is pretty powerful. And you'll start to see that. And then the last thing I would say is most of that has been focused on the elite level of the sport. We now have technologies to make it easier, and we have players and coaches that are much more comfortable with data and technology, that you can see these things move all the way down to youth football. So as you develop as an athlete, it's not just about you. Again, it's not just about your physical output. That's part of it, but also about how do you get better using both feet? How do you get better on your position? How do you compare your progress to others at your similar age group, at your similar position? So using technology to, improve that overall training and development from a player, from a coaching standpoint, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface there, but there's a huge, huge opportunity. So I think the elite is getting pretty far on how they're developing all that. The challenge is always how do you move that down the stream and make sure you're helping, the academy players, even some youth players, and whether you're just playing to enjoy the sport or playing to develop and move to the next level, how do you use this data to make that a better experience?
Yeah, well said. It's very clear that investment in this sort of like part of the game is very necessary, not just for competitive edge, but also for sustainable growth for the league, the players, and also for the overall sort of like interest in football to sustain itself. But in terms of basically, so I was watching an interview that Ronaldo did with a friend of his from Spain. Basically, he was talking about how different managers have in his career have managed him different in terms of like his sort of like recovery and training. And he feels personally, because obviously he's well into data science and obviously trying to make sure he can like postpone and elongate his career like LeBron does also. He basically says that there should be more emphasis on recovery. Like, you should basically balance out the amount of time you train with the amount of time recovery. It should basically be even. And in most cases, because of the congested nature of football fixtures, that managers or even clubs do not understand the upside in making sure that they invest in sort of like the player health in terms of the technology stack that is required. What's your opinion on this in that case?
No, 100%. I mean, I think so much of technology up to this point has been focused on how do you perform on the pitch, and let's collect data on the pitch. But there's so much that can be done off the pitch, preparing, recovering, in between. I mean, we know that especially at the highest level, how demanding the sport is, and how if you're doing really well and you're playing in multiple competitions, you could have multiple matches during the week, and it's very hard to, it's not a environment in which you tend to sit players very often or make decisions like that. So being able to make those decisions, not just with your gut or what the player is feeling, but with some data where appropriate. I mean, it's going to be a combination of both. I mean, I'm big on, as much as I've worked with technology companies, the technology alone is never going to be enough. You need to have the coach, you need to have the player, it needs to be a full conversation, because some players can handle more than others. Some players are more aware of their physical recovery than others. So I think there's a lot that could be done on the technology side from a recovery standpoint that's going into matches, after matches. And I think, again, you've seen that at the elite level. You're seeing that with some big companies that have entered the space as it relates to, I know Nike just launched a new hyper boot along with hyper ice on some things that they're doing. So I think there's definitely interest in how do you use data to maximize your performance. But that's not just when you're actually playing your sport, but what are you doing when you're not playing your sport to make sure that when you do play, you can play to the best of your ability.
As you mentioned, data alone is not enough. And just to stick on that topic of data itself, it would be fair to say that you consider yourself an operator, not solely an investor. This is consistent with people who are looking for the ability to supercharge not just growth, but create value in whatever investment they're focused on. So, like, my question to you now is basically, if you're in a club, in terms of like you're participating in the asset class in that sense, what is the sort of like the approach in terms of like the structure, in terms of trying to integrate the technology stack to make sure there's like incremental operational change that helps the club unearth that sort of value that is hidden or that is underutilized in terms of the assets?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we always want to be, it's an overused phrase, but value add investors. We are not looking to just be someone on the cap table. Me and my two partners at Ryan Sports Ventures, we all have been operators. We think that way. We think in terms of growing businesses, not just the financial side. Obviously, we got to make sure we're negotiating the right deals and go through things on the financial side. But the way we position ourselves is we've been in your shoes. We've helped to run companies. How can we help you to reach that next level? I think as it relates to clubs, because we have invested in AFC Bournemouth and the holding company there, part of our thesis is most of our areas are going to be focused on sports technology. We look at some media and content. We have a couple investments there, and then also sports properties. And part of it is to create a portfolio where appropriate, where it makes sense, bring technologies to those properties and vice versa. So at no point in time, again, we're minority investors. We're just one of many investors. It's not like we're stepping in and saying this is what you have to do, but bringing technology to the forefront to say, hey, we think this could be helpful for you, and let's make sure they at least kind of take a look at it and give it a true evaluation. And in some cases, that's really worked out. In other cases, it's not going to work out for whatever reason, right? It's not always going to be a fit. So we try not to force anything, but certainly part of our strategy is to say, how can we leverage the property investments we've made to bring technologies to enhance what they're doing from a player development, performance, recovery standpoint, and then vice versa? How can those properties help to validate and bring to light some of the technologies we have? So our two properties today have been AFC Bournemouth and the Snow League, which is a snowboarding league that Sean White launched. And in both of those cases, we brought a couple of our technology to them, and then they've made some activations around it. So far it's working in small ways, but certainly that's part of our long-term thesis, is to build a bit of an ecosystem within our portfolio.
Yeah, you mentioned a very key word there, leverage. So as a sports technologist in that sense, with the 2026 World Cup coming up to North America, which is a good thing for the world in that sense. How can European clubs and MLS clubs in that sense leverage this specific moment of the World Cup coming up technologically in the sense of growing their fan base and connecting to those fans that are not actually aligned with a specific club?
Yeah. No, it's interesting because obviously, soccer in the US has been the sport of the future for probably about 20 or 30 years now. And it's kind of always been in two categories. It's been a lot of people played it growing up, used soccer, even if they weren't super serious, but a lot of them have some exposure to it in their youth. And then there's a gap. And I think MLS has made a lot of strides. NWSL has made a lot of strides in the US, taking some of the best women athletes and having them play here in the US has been huge. I think that having the ability to have more exposure to the English Premier League and Bundesliga through some of the broadcast rights here has been helpful. Having things like the summer series, so Bournemouth will be part of the Premier League summer series where they're going to be playing some matches here in the U.S. Just finding ways to make it more personal, so you're not just watching it on TV. And I think having the best players in the world, being able to come and see them in person, I think will make a huge impact. I mean, it's been a long time since the World Cup was here. I think that it's one thing to watch it on TV. It's another thing to experience it in person. And I think there's a lot of expectations that coming out of the World Cup, people have a full appreciation for what that looks like, what that means to other leagues around the world. I think having Messi come to the MLS has been huge, even though he's at the tail end of his career, but you can still see what he's been able to do and bring more attention, bring more exposure, bring some other athletes into the MLS. So I think there's still a lot that could be done leveraging the fandom on those best players in the world, because everyone has an appreciation for the best players. There's still some education that we have in terms of understanding there's different leagues around the world. I mean, it's again, the concept of relegation and promotion is not something we're used to. But I think once people get their arms around that here in the U.S., they'll really become fans. I mean, I personally have, the two sports I watch the most now are the English Premier League and global football and Formula One. If you would have told me that 5 years ago, I probably would have thought you were crazy. But it's because of the way they've made those global entities and made it much easier to appreciate and keep track of what's going on in those sports, even though they don't physically happen in the U.S. very often. I think that's been very powerful.
Okay, let's pull that thread then. You mentioned Formula One. I am also
Yep.
a fan of Formula One. So looking at F1 now in terms of its supercharged exponential trajectory over time, over a relatively short time, to be frank, in terms of the U.S. market and all the emerging markets. What can sort of soccer or football in that sense sort of take and leverage and sort of implement in the football ecosystem in general?
Yeah, I mean it's amazing. Formula One, I've known of being in the sports world. I've known of and been a casual fan of Formula One for a long time. It's a very technical sport. Is you kind of know going in who's probably going to win or be the couple drivers that are going to win. It's not a very even sport as it relates to that. I mean, they're going into the season, that there's teams that are hoping to get into fourth, fifth, sixth place. They'd be happy with that versus those that are fighting for a championship. Again, very foreign to us. What pulled me into Formula One again was my 19-year-old daughter, who had shown no interest in NASCAR, no interest in motorsports, and it was Drive to Survive, the Netflix series. And the brilliance of what that was, I mean, I think they benefited in a weird way from the timing of it around COVID and people having more time and appreciation for watching those, but they made it about the drivers. They made it about the storylines. They didn't make it about the technology. They didn't make it about the specifics within the cars. They made it more emotional, and they produced it in a way that drew people into the sport. And then once they were drawn in, they appreciated everything else. So I think that the learnings there the ways to attract more casual fans and make them become more rabid fans by introducing the sport in different ways. An example in global football has been Wrexham. Not only do they have the star power and they've been playing very well, but the TV show has drawn people in. And so now a club in Wales that have been there forever that no one's ever heard of, if you ask anybody in the US, they've heard of Wrexham because of Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney and what they did, not only investing and building the club, but the show that they created and how that drew people in. So I think the blurring lines between sports and entertainment, while some traditionalists may not like that, I think the next generation, which we're very focused on the next generation of sports fans. And I have 5 kids between the age of 13 and almost 22. They engage and watch sports dramatically different than I ever did. How do we draw them in different ways? How do we find the next Formula One fans? How do we find the next global football fans? And it's not going to be the traditional way of I'm just watching it because my parents watched it. It's going to be speaking to them on social, telling stories, having more captivating ways to pull them into the sport than just sit and watch a match or watch a race.
Oh, well said, well said. Especially like as you mentioned, the change in viewing habits and the change in demographics is going to be keys for not just football fans or football executives, but for sports executives to pay attention to try to understand how the different dynamics have changed and how we should change the model of how we approach these fans and engage with them. But transitioning to women's football, what's your opinion on the sort of like the investment landscape in terms of the different growth trajectories we've seen vis-a-vis the European football for women, but also the other markets, so the emerging markets in South America and Asia, but also specifically the American market?
Yeah, no, it's been amazing to see the growth just in the last couple of years. What the NWSL has done has been phenomenal, both in driving viewership, drive the valuations of the clubs have just grown exponentially. I know they're continuing to expand. I think you're going to start to see that more internationally. I think part of the challenge becomes some of those women's clubs are associated with the men's clubs. So how do you start to separate them? It's always been viewed as a secondary to the men's club, and I think that's not only is that not fair from a women's standpoint, but it also takes away from some of the opportunity and the investment opportunity from a women's focused area. So I know there's some groups that are trying to work on how you separate those. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity there. But yeah, we're in the very, very early stages developing the overall infrastructure for women's standalone global football. It's, I think, in a weird way, unlike on the men's side where it started outside the U.S. and then it's coming to the U.S., we're almost doing it the opposite there. I think the NWSL is really leading the way in how they're building that up, and you'll start to see that expand internationally. So it's been an interesting part on the U.S. that the women's U.S. national team was always way more popular than the men's national team, and that's now finally starting to trickle down into the professional leagues as well on the women's side. And I think there's just a huge opportunity there. It's something we've been making a few investments in on the overall space, and keeping track of, because not only is it a great story, it is a huge investment opportunity because it's still very early stage of growing out the infrastructure and growing out what that overall part of the industry could become.
Yeah. So in terms of, you mentioned investment opportunity and infrastructure, what are those sort of like investment opportunities in terms of like technological innovations for the women's game that you see as opportunities to capture and add value there?
Well, I think a lot of the things that have existed in the men's game for a long time just haven't existed as much in the women's game. So the ability to collect certain information, make it more specific to the women's game, is not just copy and paste from the men's game, make it more specific to that. You're starting to see that in terms of some of the ways some of the data capture from a camera standpoint and wearable standpoint continue to impact the game. We have another company called Sportable that puts a chip inside of the soccer ball, and collects a bunch of data around how you do from a training standpoint and from a game standpoint. And they're working on a few pretty significant deals in the women's side that should be coming out pretty soon. So you're starting to see technology and data capture that has existed in the men's game for a long time finally coming over to the women's game. And I think that'll help to drive the rest of the infrastructure and be able to drive different opportunities going forward. Because again, those things have existed on the men's side for the last 10, 20 years. They're just now starting to be developed on the women's side. And I think once that's there, you can start to build off of that, and there'll be plenty of other opportunities. And that'll be just like we were talking earlier, from an overall performance, from a recovery standpoint, all those things that still need to come to the men's side. You can say the exact same thing about the women's side, just with the ability to build more of the support structure around it as well.
Right. Looking at it from your lens as an investor, a sports investor in that sense, I know that Ryan Sports focuses on the sort of like, property, media, content, and obviously technology. What's sort of the investment philosophy that your team and yourself approach investments to be able to take that decision to participate in a cap table?
Yeah, I mean, we look at it across all three of those areas. I mean, most of our focus is on the sports technology side, so more earlier stage companies. So that's where most of our investments have been made, most of our energy is. On the media and content side, it's really around making strategic investments in areas that we think are in huge opportunities. The two we've made in that area have been Just Women's Sports, which is a women's sports focused media enterprise, which is exactly what we were talking about. Being able to build out the infrastructure to focus just on women's sports and not just make it a afterthought in the men's sports ecosystem. And then the second investment we made is in Men in Blazers, which is a global football media company that's very focused on the U.S. market. And again, as a lead into the World Cup, as a lead into what we see as a growing fandom in the U.S., having the Roger Bennett, who runs that company, is one of the most trusted voices in global football in the U.S. market. So backing him and being able to make a bet within that space within the U.S. So from a media content standpoint, it's less about volume and more about making very clear strategic investments, and those two have been that way. And then the properties are going to be pretty different. Again, few and far between. We're focused very much on emerging sports and leagues and properties. Obviously, the English Premier League is not an emerging league, but AFC Bournemouth is more of an emerging team within that league. Historically, not been in the Premier League. They got a big match today against Man City, currently sitting in 11th, but still hoping to make a push for Europe. They've had the last two seasons have been the most points they've ever scored in the Premier League. So they're a more emerging team in the Premier League. And then I mentioned Snow League, that we've looked at a lot of other areas of emerging properties in sports where we think there's a very unique opportunity to focus on a specific fan base. Snowboarding has always been one of the most popular events within Winter Olympics, but that only happens every 4 years. How do you leverage something, and obviously leverage a name like Shaun White, who's been probably the most famous snowboarder in the history of the sport, and leverage his connection to the athletes to make something more unique. So a lot of our focus on the property side is on finding things that are unique, that speak to audiences in a different way. We're not the group that's looking to have just a small stake in a big four sports team here in the U.S. It's really looking at those emerging sports and leagues and how we can leverage technology and our media side to strengthen their position as well.
Yeah, for sure. This is very, very well said. I mean, Shaun White is the equivalent of Tony Hawk in that sense, or maybe
Yep.
the vice versa. But so shifting to technology platforms. So my question here is basically trying to understand from your perspective, how should sports entities, not specifically football clubs, because your background is very diverse in that sense, how should sport entities think about partnering with the technological provider in terms of making sure that it's the right fit? What's the process in terms of evaluating, the partnering?
Yeah. It can be hard because there's so many companies out there, there's so many technologies out there, and they've all gotten very good at marketing themselves. And so it's hard to understand who's the strongest, who's got the best technology, and it takes a lot of time. So I think there are some resources that clubs can rely on. I think a lot of it just it goes back to what we talked about in my other experiences in other businesses. You gotta hire the right people. So you got to hire the right people who are overseeing making the right personnel decisions, that are overseeing your athlete development and recovery and training. And those people will be able to know which technologies are appropriate to their style. Because not every technology is going to fit with everybody, but with their style, what they're used to doing, what their expectations are. I think in a lot of ways, clubs look at emerging technologies and think, okay, I can leverage this. They really need some credibility. I'm going to get it for free, or I'm going to get it at low cost. But then you got to question, will that company be around long enough? They need to be able to build a business long enough to completely support you. So there's always a balance there. I think most of the best clubs realize it's not about leveraging their position to get free technology. It's about making sure that it fits within your overall culture and your focus. So at AFC Bournemouth, they hired a manager Ariel Andoni, who has a playing style. It's very aggressive. It's very forward looking. It's very attack based. So being able to train their athletes to be prepared for that, because it can be very grueling, especially now, right now we're at the end of the season, you got 2 matches left. You got to make sure you have enough left in the tank. So being able to have someone who can look at the entire season and make sure we're not just preparing for match one, but when you got match 37 and 38, that we have everybody available to play. We've been managing our injuries, that everybody's playing to their maximum output, and it matches with the overall strategy. So I think once you have the right people in place in terms of making your overall strategy decisions, then the technology fits underneath that. But it is hard just because there's so many different companies out there. They're really good at pitching themselves. And I feel like that's where we can help as well in terms of how we can position that, providing some credibility, knowing that you have some significant backers behind some of these technologies, that we've done our due diligence to say, hey, this is something that can really be sustainable. I think that usually helps as we bring things to clubs.
Okay. Even a sports executive or football executives, to be specific, is watching this or listening to this, what promising new categories or specific companies in the sport technology landscape should they be thinking about partnering with right now?
I think there's still a lot to be done on the physical output side. Again, as we talked about earlier, there was cameras, there was wearables. I think there's the next phase of it. And again, it's bias. I've already mentioned them, but both Player Maker and Sportable are companies we invest in that are doing things on that side that are more tactically focused. Combines kind of physical output with tactical focus, which I think is where the world is going. I think also the player identification part is always in global football a key part of it. So being able to leverage technology that can be easily used downstream. So how do you find the next emerging player I know everybody focused on South America. What about Asia? I mean, Asia is going to be the next wave of athletes coming out. How do you identify them? How do you make sure that you aren't just, yes, you'll fly people out there and look at them, but how can you leverage video, data, other technology to be able to at least have some initial assessments of how athletes are developing? And how do you start to bring them over into your academies? AFC Bournemouth is part of a multi-club ownership. I know a lot of other groups are like that, where they're trying to have multiple clubs at different stages so that you can identify players early on, maybe bring them to one club so they can develop and get more experience before you bring them up to the more senior clubs. So I think leveraging technology to be able to identify players and then be able to identify whether or not they can fit within a certain playing style. So as I mentioned, Bournemouth has a very specific playing style. They're going to go want to look for players that can fit within that style. So being able to identify them early, develop them along the way, and do it in a cost efficient way would be pretty important. So I think those are, from a global football standpoint, those are probably two big areas that everybody's very focused on.
Okay. And so considering the future and, the changing landscape in terms of technology and also the consuming habits of fans, what do you think, where do you see the future of, pairing data and performance insights from football training or maybe match days itself to convert that into potential fan facing content?
Yeah. Oh, it's already happening, and it's pretty exciting. I mean, when you think about, again, going back to Formula One, I mean, they use data pretty significantly. I think different AR, XR experiences, I think, will continue to be a part of how people emerge themselves into sport and using through information to do that. I mean, there's been a lot of very immersive things coming out within all sports, but I think within global football and sports like Formula One, even the NFL, I think it's ways to bring people more close to what happens in the game, not just watching it more casually. So I think having more interactive and more personalized experiences. I mean, the old way of watching these sports where I'm going to sit back and just watch it as it happens. Now being able to say each individual viewer wants to view things differently. I think one of the things that was a huge step forward was when Amazon took over Thursday night rights for the NFL, and they created a couple different streams that you could watch for NFL games. And one of them was a next gen stats stream where you can actually see the stats on the screen. Now, the push was always, well, not everybody wants to see that. Okay, well, if you want to see it, here's a stream. If you don't, here's something else. Making it more personalized, so that I think that's the first step in that direction. Eventually, get to the point that we understand how Ibrahim wants to watch games, and we're going to deliver an experience that's catered to what you're looking for versus maybe what I'm looking for. You may want to have live betting right next to the match, and I don't want to have anything to do that. You might want to have your fantasy stats right there. You might want to have multiple games going up. You might want to be able to watch your match and be able to buy merchandise from a player after he just scored a goal. Like, those things are now possible through technology. Not everybody wants that experience, but being able to make it so that it's more personalized, so each individual person or group of people can opt into the experience that they want. And I think if done right, it ends up, it's a rising tide. It'll raise all the boats, and it'll be able to make you a more engaging fan because you're getting a personalized experience, and I am as well, even though they might be very different. So I think leveraging technology, leveraging data to immerse the fan in their own way, but making it personalized is a big key to make sure that it really lands going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. I can't disagree with that. Those are key pointers for people to pay attention to and try to drive the next phase of growth for the industry. But in terms of the academy and youth development, from a
Mhm.
technology perspective, where do you see the sort of like upside for innovation in that sense, and where can potentially football itself, the football industry in Europe and also the MLS, adopt learnings from, let's say, MLS or the NFL or even college football in that sense?
Yeah, I've heard for a long time that the scouting side of things is much more advanced here in the US, whereas the individual personalized training can be more advanced outside of the US. I think that being able to, again, we talked about a personalized experience on the viewers. I think that's also true for individual players. I think some players get caught up in trying to play in a way that doesn't fit them. So being able to use information to make it more personalized for them, come up with a personalized training plan, come up with a personalized engagement plan. And again, not everybody's going to make it to the top levels, but maybe it's level 2 or 3 is where they'll cap out, and being able to leverage that and make sure what you can. So I think on the US side, we've done a lot within the youth sports space that's really grown in an asset class that's grown in the focus around it. I think that being able to make sure that doesn't get too out of control will be our concern as a parent of kids. You want them to also be kids. So finding a balance between enjoying being a kid and enjoying the sport that you love and developing. I think that sometimes we professionalize it a little bit too early. I think one of the things I loved growing up was playing a lot of different sports. And now I think that people become too specialized too early. So I'm a big fan of playing as many different sports as you can, as early as you can, getting exposure to a lot of different things. And I know that higher level coaches appreciate that as well, because it's not just about individual skills you're developing. It's about being a holistic athlete and a holistic person. And so I think being able to leverage a lot of this stuff to make sure that we can enhance you as an athlete. But I think from a youth standpoint, an academy standpoint, we got to step back and say, these are still kids. So we got to let them be kids too.
So you're more concerned about the development of the kids, but when I look at the American markets, you see, sort of like congressmen in specific states trying to create bills around giving high schoolers basically the ability to commercialize the brand and the entity without even going to college itself or even
Yeah.
becoming pro athletes. It's not a bill yet, but where do you stand on that? And also looking at the European market where academy players are not really commercialized in that sense. Where is the balance in terms of trying to make sure that they're also not being left behind compared to their peers in the US market?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I mean, it's probably a whole another podcast unto itself. But we've had a huge swing from athletes being so restricted in what they could do. They couldn't even like accept a free meal as a college athlete. And then with name, image, likeness, or NIL and the transfer portal, we've now broken that wide open to now it's swung all the way to the other extreme that players have agents when they're in high school and they're negotiating deals to go to college based on how much they're going to get paid. I think that we'll end up, like a lot of things in life, you'll end up somewhere in the middle. I think it's going to require probably some legislation, hopefully some legislation that makes sense, but something in the middle where there's some guideposts around it. I mean, I think the old model didn't make sense because it was so against the athlete. The new model, I think, just opens up so much, chaos where an athlete can get paid to go to one school and then he doesn't even have to show up and he transfers to another school. It just creates a lot of, and like you said, I mean, high school players being able to commercialize, my initial reaction is, hey, why not? I mean, if they have the ability to do that, just like if you built a social media standing as a young athlete or a young person, you should be able to commercialize that. But at the same time, there are people that are, not everybody can do that, and they're probably being taken advantage of by people that think that get there in the head and think they can turn into something huge. So there's got to be some guideposts around what is possible and what's not to protect the institutions, but also to protect the athletes and make sure that they're not taken advantage of and that they can go after. I think they should be able to commercialize what they can do, but I think they also should be able to work within an overall system to be able to, I can imagine how hard it is for a college now. You spend all your time recruiting a player, maybe he sticks around for 1 year and then he goes on to the next school. You see that at a lot of major college programs right now, you almost have to start over every year. Now, the old model was you committed to a school and you're stuck there. So that didn't work. Now we're down to almost like complete chaos. We got to find a middle ground.
Right. Yeah, balance is very important in every aspect of life, especially when you're dealing with adolescents. So you completely with you on this point. So let's transition to the rapid fire round. So I just ask you a question and you tell me what comes to mind in terms of your answer. So the first question to me would be, looking at your career now and looking at the future of the sport, where do you see, the sort of like the challenges in terms of like the football industry from a technological perspective, and where do you see the opportunities?
I think the challenges are, again, making sense of all the different options that are out there. As we said earlier, there's just so many different technologies that'll keep coming. How do you make sense of it? How do you use it? How do you make it applicable to your individual program or your individual athlete? I think the flip side of that is the opportunity is once you're able to do that, I think it increases what you can do from an overall output standpoint, but also, again, ways that you can bring people into the game from a participation standpoint and from a fandom standpoint, being able to use data and technology to make that experience even better. I mean, I don't see those as two independent things. There's technology that can make athletes better, and by using that in certain ways, you can draw fans more into the game. So I think that's where a lot of the best companies will be able to solve both of those problems.
Outside of Bournemouth, which football club do you think is currently punching above its weight from a technological perspective?
Whew, that's a good question. I'm obviously very biased because of our standing in Bournemouth, but I mean, you look at there's a few other clubs. I mean, like Nottingham Forest right now has had an amazing run. I mean, again, it was just a couple of seasons ago they were on the brink of relegation, and for them to be, kind of fighting for a Champions League spot is pretty impressive. I think there's some clubs there in the middle with Brighton and Brentford that have done very well as well. So I think when you look at the, traditionally, English Premier League has been and a lot of the major clubs have been. It's a very linear between your how much you pay on players and your position in the table. We're now starting to see a couple clubs like Bournemouth, who is I believe this year they're the second lowest payroll, and yet we're sitting in 11th, hopefully ending up a little bit higher than that. So I think there's been a couple clubs that have punched above their weight in that sense, and the trick will be continuing that to do that, because all those clubs are in that tricky middle where you have to develop players and then eventually you sign them or sell them to bigger clubs. So one of our best young players at Bournemouth, Dean Howson, is going to leave to go to Real Madrid at the end of the season. He was only with us for 1 year. A lot of people think he'll be one of the best, center backs in the sport in the next few years. So we had him for 1 year and we got a really good return for him going forward, but now we got to replace him. So being able to use, again, we go back to what we talked about earlier, the development of those players. We have some players that are playing in other teams that we think could step in and be the next person to fill those shoes. But it's a tough balance you got to do when you're in the middle of the pack.
Yeah. Bought for 15 million, sold for 50. Brian, thank you. This has been an outstanding conversation. You've given us very rare insights into the industry from a tech and data perspective, but also from a strategic investment perspective. So thank you again for coming on.
Of course. No, thanks for the conversation. It was fun.
Perfect. Now, the listener and a watcher, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share with like-minded football industry participants. And thank you again for listening. Till next time, take care. Bye.